Now do you see the audience?
Yes, now I see the audience.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. And I'm going to keep my remarks somewhat short so as to enable you to ask me any questions you might have. What I'd like to do is formulate my remarks in terms of what are the typical questions that are asked regarding the events of October 7th and thereafter. And those questions which typically come up fall into basically two categories. The first is, do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? Do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? That question has become standard, and if you answer no, you are no longer part of the conversation. And if you answer yes, you are part of the conversation, but in my opinion, the price is too high for becoming part of the conversation. So, how should that question be answered? Do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? And in my opinion, the question should be reformulated to what should Hamas have done on October 7th? Or what should Hamas have done on the night of October 6th? That is, what were Hamas's options? I don't believe you can address any moral question. A moral question is one where there are options and then you choose between the options. I don't believe you can address any moral question until and unless you have laid out the possible options. What are the choices that you're making? Because moral questions are fundamentally about choice. You don't condemn a lion for devouring a human being for a very simple reason. A lion has no choice. It's fixed into its being that if it sees an animate object that's worthy of consuming, they're going to consume it. So we have to look at the choices, the options. And here I think we have to begin with the basic facts, which in my opinion are not open to dispute. They're not open to contestation. Number one, Gaza is overwhelmingly a refugee population. The population, or Gaza itself, became Gaza after the first Arab-Israeli War in 1948. About 270,000 Palestinian Arabs who lived in Israel were expelled to Gaza by the newly created Israeli state. And right now, the estimates are about 80% of Gaza's population consists of refugees from 1948 or the descendants of refugees. Number two, Gaza is in half a child population. About the estimates are 48% of Gaza's population comprises children. So whenever you hear about 2,000-pound bombs being dropped on Gaza, missiles being launched at Gaza, thousands, tens of thousands of artillery shells being fired inside Gaza. You have to bear in mind that on the receiving end of those bombs, missiles, and artillery shells, on the receiving end are in half children. Time doesn't allow to fully discuss, to fully describe what Gaza looks like, what the experience of the people of Gaza. But one image keeps recurring. And that image, let's start with 1955. The main UN representative in Gaza, because Gaza had a refugee population, there was a UN presence there to supervise the refugee population. The main UN representative was a fellow named E.L.M. Burns, E.L.M. Burns. And at one point, he described Gaza. Now, bear in mind, so there's no misunderstanding, in 1955, Gaza was under Egyptian administrative control, not Israeli, Egyptian. And E.L.M. Burns described Gaza as a concentration camp. Shortly after the 1967 war, the father of the former U.S. presidential candidate, Al Gore, the father of Al Gore, he visited the Middle East. He was a U.S. senator, and he visited the Middle East. And the father of Al Gore was our presidential candidate. The father of Al Gore, he visited the Middle East, and he visited Gaza. This is shortly after Israel took over Gaza in mid-1967, after the June 1967 war. How did he describe Gaza? He described Gaza as a concentration camp. In 2004, the head of Israel's National Security Council, his name was Giora Eiland. He's still a very influential figure in Israel. Giora Eiland is a person at the right-wing point of the political spectrum. He advocates the spreading of epidemics in order for Israel to achieve its goals. And this is not what you call a peacenik. He's a right-wing Israeli. And then when he was the head of the National Security Council in Gaza, National Security Council in Israel, he described Gaza as, quote, a huge concentration camp. One of Israel's leading sociologists, Baruch Kimmerling, he's no longer with us, he's passed. He wrote a small book in 2002. How did he describe Gaza? He said Gaza was, quote, the biggest concentration camp ever to exist. The leading Israeli journalistic authority on Gaza is a woman named Amir Haas. And Amir Haas's family, her parents, passed through the Nazi Holocaust. Still, the question was put to her. She replied that yes, Gaza is a concentration camp. And she had spent a lot of time there in Gaza. She actually wrote a book on the subject. But it wasn't just a concentration camp. Gaza was also a killing field. That is to say, periodically, Israel would launch what it called its mowing lawn in Gaza. It was going to mow the lawn in Gaza. And what is mowing the lawn in Gaza? It's basically a high-tech killing spree. Israel comes in with its cutting-edge military technology, and it kills and destroys everything within the range of its cutting-edge military arsenal. In Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, Israel killed 350 children. It destroyed 6,000 homes. Operation Protective Edge in July-August 2014, Israel killed 550 children, destroyed 18,000 homes. So, if you want to get a picture of Gaza in your mind, which in my opinion is perfectly accurate to the reality, imagine a people who are enclosed in a concentration camp. They can't leave. They can't, all they have is the perimeter. Gaza is 26 miles long, 5 miles wide. All they have is the perimeter of the camp to pace each. There was barely any work in Gaza. 60% of the youth were unemployed. About 50% of the population in general in Gaza was unemployed. There was no past, no present, no future in Gaza. Most of the people in Gaza were born into a concentration camp. They were going to languish in a concentration camp, and they were going to die in the concentration camp. And periodically, this concentration camp changed into, metamorphosed into a killing field. When Israel launched its operations, as it calls them, its operation to mow the lawn in Gaza. Mowing the lawn means inflicting periodically, not once, not twice, not 3 times, not 4 times, not 5 times, many, many times, periodically launching these high-tech killing sprees in Gaza. Now, it might be said, but it was Hamas that brought all this on because of its terroristic goals, in particular the goal to destroy the state of Israel. So the claim is made that the responsibility for the horror that I believe I accurately described, that the responsibility for the horror belongs to Hamas. But what does the record show? The record shows that soon after Hamas was elected into power in 2006, in January 2006, Hamas was elected into power. And the record shows that soon after attaining power, Hamas had shown a willingness to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict in accordance with international law and United Nations resolutions. That is, it was accepting of a two-state element of conflict along what's called the June 1967 border, which is to say Israel's existence would be accepted in the whole of Israel, and a Palestinian state would be founded in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. That's the international terms for resolving the conflict, and Hamas had effectively accepted those terms. But Israel and the United States rejected any negotiation, any diplomatic settlement, short of the terms that Israel demanded, and those terms effectively meant the complete surrender of the people of Gaza. So you might say, okay, it's true that Hamas was willing to accept diplomatic settlement of the conflict, but why did it have to? Why did it have to resort to force? But the fact of the matter is, Hamas didn't resort to force initially. If you look at March 2018, Hamas attempted nonviolent civil resistance in order to end the blockade of Gaza. They attempted nonviolent civil resistance to end the blockade of Gaza, the blockade which prohibited goods from going to Gaza, goods from being exported from Gaza, the blockade that prohibited people from coming into Gaza and prohibited people from leaving Gaza, including medical patients who are suffering from cancer and were looking for medical treatment abroad. They were not allowed to leave Gaza. So in March 2018, the people of Gaza, including Hamas, attempted nonviolent civil resistance. What did Israel do? Israel lined up against the fence separating Gaza from Israel. Israel lined up its best snipers, its most accurate, snipers. And as the people of Gaza marched in nonviolent civil resistance, as the people of Gaza marched in nonviolent civil resistance, what did the Israeli snipers do? Well, we know for certain what they did. There's a very large UN report which details exactly what snipers did. And according to the UN report, Israel targeted medics, it targeted journalists, it targeted children, and it targeted people with physical disabilities, such as double amputees. These people were nowhere near the fence. According to the UN report, they were between 100 and 300 meters from the fence when they were the fence separating Israel from Gaza, when they were targeted by the snipers and either murdered or the snipers targeted their legs from the knee down so as to inflict life-changing injury on the demonstrators, to paralyze them for life. So, what is the picture on October 6th? The picture is approximately 2.3 million people, half of them children, living in a concentration camp. Overwhelmingly, they were born into that concentration camp. They were languishing in the concentration camp and they would die in the concentration camp. Their elected leadership attempted a diplomatic resolution of the conflict on the basis of international law and UN resolutions. They were ignored. Israel demanded total surrender. And then they attempted nonviolent civil resistance, and they were targeted for death for the infliction of life-changing injuries. Well, as you can guess, or as you can see, because the facts of my opinion are incontestable, as you can see, the Hamas leadership had very few options. And now we come down to the limited options they had. They knew from experience diplomacy work, and they knew from experience that nonviolent civil resistance wouldn't work. They also knew that in 2006, on October 6th, 2023, the Gaza question was disappearing. You will remember in the audience that at that point, all the talk was about the Abraham Accords being extended, Saudi Arabia joining US-Israeli alliance, and Gaza would be just left there with the people waiting to die. So, given those very limited options available to Hamas, it mounted a military operation. Now, the military operation, it seems to me, raises only one question: that they had the right to launch a military operation seems to me unarguable. They had the right. They tested all the other options and they failed. So they had the right to launch a military operation. But then the question becomes the choice of targets, namely combatants versus civilians. And I would answer as follows. Approximately 1,200 people were killed on October 7th. Of those 1,200, 350 were combatants, 850 were civilians. Those are the rough numbers. I'm not going to quarrel over the numbers right now. Roughly 850 civilians, 350 combatants. So let's take hypothetical. Let's assume that Hamas had only targeted combatants. All 1,200 people killed on October 7th were combatants. Would that have politically, I'm not talking about morally right now, would that politically have changed anything? In my opinion, the answer is no. Israel would have acted exactly the same way if 1,200 combatants had been killed on October 7th, as they reacted when 350 combatants and 850 civilians were killed. Israel is a Spartan society. It's a militarized society, and the life of a combatant has higher value than the life of a civilian. So if Hamas only targeted combatants, I do not believe politically it would have made a difference in Israel's reaction. Would it have made a difference to states around the world? States. And there my answer is no, it would not have made a difference. The US government would have supported Israel's genocidal operation, even if only combatants were killed. The US government would have supported Israel's genocidal reaction, even if only combatants were killed. That's also true of the UK. That's also true of France. That's also true of Germany. The reaction would have been identical whether civilians were killed or combatants were killed. Would it have made a difference in the perception of the general public? My answer to that is probably not. It would have been perceived as Hamas, unprovoked, had launched a military operation and killed 1,200 Israeli youth for no reason. And the reaction, Israel's genocidal reaction, would probably have been supported as much by the general public as by government and Israel itself, even if it were combatants. But that still leaves the moral question. We're not talking about the reaction of Israelis. We're not talking about the reaction of the states. Not even talking about popular opinion. We're talking about something separate, the moral question. And there my answer is going to be the following. First of all, it seems that Hamas's main goal on October 7th was to shatter, to destroy the status quo. That is to convey to the world that you will not just move on and ignore our fate. If we're going to die, we won't die passively. Hamas also wanted to transmit the message that if our civilians aren't safe, if our civilians aren't free, then your civilians aren't safe. Your civilians aren't free. You are not going to hold music festivals right outside the walls of our concentration camp and act as if there is nothing wrong with holding music festivals right outside the walls of our concentration camp, half of which comprises children who also would like to, but never will, attend a music festival. Children who want to enjoy their youth. Children too who want to experience happiness, love, and a future. You are not going to hold music festivals outside our concentration camp. And so there was an intentional targeting of civilians in order to create a national crisis and to transmit the message that we will not die peacefully and your civilians will face the same fate as our Europeans. Now, it has to also be said that in my own country, the United States, there had been, before the Civil War, which ended slavery, there had been slave revolts in the United States. And the slave revolts were not pretty pictures. The rebels in these slave revolts, they killed men, they killed women, they killed children. They were very brutal. No question about it. But there's an interesting footnote. Even though the leaders of the slave revolts killed men, women, and children, now, which is to say, 200 years later, 200 years, now 150 years, let's say, well, now, a long time later, the slave revolts were beginning around 1800, so a little more than 200 years ago. Now, the leaders of those slave revolts who killed civilians, only civilians, men, women, and children, the leaders of those slave revolts occupy an honored place in American history. They are respected. They are honored. And if you were to ask my opinion, my guess is, even though massive numbers of civilians were killed on October 7th, my guess is that the leaders of the October 7th slave revolt will be honored in the future in the world. I know that's a shocking statement to make, but I base that statement on the fate of the leaders of our own slave revolts in the United States, people like Nat Turner, who are now honored figures. Now, it's 10:30. Are the organizers of the conference there?
Yes, Professor.
Okay. I think I've gone for a half hour. How would you want me to proceed at this point?
You can continue your speech, and last 10 minutes, we can collect some questions, and I will ask, direct them to you. Is it okay with you?
So I should continue for another 10 minutes?
Yeah, I think it will be all right.
Okay.
And please go on.
Okay. The second question, the first question always asked is, do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? The second question is, what should Israel have done? And that question basically means, did Israel have the right of self-defense? A horror occurred on October 7th. 1,200 people were killed. 850 of them were civilians. Did Israel have the right to self-defense? What should Israel have done? And there it seems to me we have to ask two questions. Number one, did Israel have the right to self-defense? And to that question, I would put a simple analogy to you in the audience, and you decide for yourself whether the analogy is valid. Let's take the case of a wife in a marriage, and the wife is the victim of the physical abuse of her husband. And he beats her, and he beats her, and he beats her, relentlessly beating her. She lets out screams, She lets out shrieks. She yells. The neighbors hear it. The neighbors hear the shrieks and the yells of the battered woman. They hear the shrieks, the screams, the yells of the battered woman. But the neighbors do nothing. They know exactly what's going on, but they turn away and do nothing. The woman finally summons the courage to call the police. The police come to her home, but then they tell her, this is a domestic dispute. This is between you and your husband. It's not our business. And the police do nothing. Well, one day, her husband is approaching her, and he grabs a knife, and she stabs him. She stabs him once. She stabs him twice. She stabs him 3, 4, and 5 times. At that point, he grabs a gun and he shoots her dead. Now, on a legal level, in court, he probably would win on the grounds that he acted in self-defense. He had the right to self-defense. She stabbed him and stabbed him and stabbed him, and finally he killed her. But then you have to ask yourself the question, morally, did he have the right to self-defense? And I say the same thing in Gaza. After tormenting the people of Gaza, after confining them in a concentration camp, and then periodically subjecting them to those high-tech killing sprees, I say that Israel, by its actions, had, and I don't care what the law says, I say as a moral question, Israel had forfeited its right to self-defense on October 7th. It had no right to self-defense any more than the battering husband had the right to kill the battered wife in self-defense. They had no right to self-defense. But there's a second question. Is Israel acting in self-defense? That's not true. That's a flat-out lie. Israel claims that its goals are to defeat Hamas and to restore the hostages, to return the hostages to Israel. That's not its real goal. That's a goal. I'm not going to deny that. I'm not going to deny it. But that's not its real goal. Its real goal is perfectly transparent and was made perfectly clear by South Africa when it went before the International Court of Justice. Israel, said South Africa, is not conducting a war of self-defense. Israel is conducting a genocide. That's very different. In a war of self-defense, you want to inflict a military defeat on the combatants on the opposite side. In a genocide, Your ultimate goal is not to inflict a military defeat. Your ultimate goal is to annihilate the civilian population. That's very different. This is not a war of self-defense. It's a genocide designed to annihilate a civilian population. If it were a war, you would have to answer a very simple question. If it were a war, why is targeting universities? Why did it destroy every university in Gaza? If it were a war, why did Israel target the hospitals in Gaza? 20 of the 36 hospitals in Gaza have been vaporized, pulverized. Does that sound like a war, or does that sound like a genocide? If it were a war, why did Israel direct Palestinians to what it called safe havens in the south and then drop 2,000-pound bombs on the safe havens? Does that sound like a war, or does that sound like a genocide? If it were a war, why is it that more journalists have been killed in Gaza than anywhere else in the world in a wartime situation? Why is it that more medical personnel have been killed in Gaza than in any military situation? Why is it, if it's a war, that Israel is, according to the testimony of foreign doctors who served in Gaza, 45 foreign doctors who served in Gaza, why is it based on their testimony that Israel is targeting children in the skull and in the chest? Why is that if it's a war? So every time you're asked the question, doesn't Israel have the right to self-defense? The correct answer is, number one, I don't believe they have the right to self-defense any more than a spouse batterer has the right to self-defense. And number two, it's not self-defense. It's not a war. It's the question you're really asking is, doesn't Israel have the right to commit genocide? And there I think the answer is perfectly clear. Okay.
Thank you so much for your speech. It is a great chance to hear your thoughts and ideas in here, Sakarya University. So there are some questions that passed down to me, and if you are okay with it,
I'll take 3 questions because I'm pressed for time.
Okay. Does the audience has any question? One here. Okay. Okay. I will read you the first question, and after your answer, I will read the second one. So the person that asked these questions asked that maybe it is a very simple question, but nobody can answer it. The Zionist regime is already following a certain policy, but the Middle Eastern and Muslim countries, especially Gulf and Saudis, are not able to react fully. At least they have not cut off the oil as they did in the 73. Is it really only about power politics? And why can't Muslims show the necessary reaction?
I believe that question is wrongly formulated. The Arab Muslim countries are doing exactly what they want to do. They all want to see Hamas defeated. They all want to see Hezbollah defeated. And they all want to see Iran defeated. They view that as being in their interest, and they're acting according to their interest. I would also add the Palestinian Authority would be very happy to see Hamas defeated. I am positive they were euphoric, they were thrilled when Yahya Sinwar was killed. These are very corrupt, power-hungry elites, and they are acting perfectly in accordance with their interests as they conceive their interests.
Thank you. I will ask another one. And you said 3 questions, right?
Yes.
Okay. Another one is the power of Israel, is the power of the... Okay. Is the power of Israel, is the power of the US infinite? Does this mean the end of history for the West again? Because after the Cold War, they targeted Islam as the new enemy instead of communism.
The United States has very real interests in the Middle East. This is not a confusion on the part of the US. And they see Israel as a principal base of US control in the Middle East. So it's not as if they are simply in search of an ideology to justify their actions. They are convinced that Israel's strength is also the US's strength in controlling the region. So it is true that they create enemies. One time it was communists, then it was Islamic fundamentalists. At one point it was Arab nationalists. That was the enemy. People like Abdul Nasser. But ultimately, I believe it's about U.S. interests in the region, its desire to control the region, and its exploitation of Israel to control the region.
Thank you so much. And the last one. Okay, then this was kind of a personal question, so I won't ask it. So I think that's all. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, we have one question. Just
Dear Professor, thank you very much for your speech. We always learn a lot with you, finally, more than ever in this last year. And only 2 questions. How far, to what extent? Okay. How far, to what extent do you think the second colonial Israeli regime is collapsing? First question. And the second question, don't you think that BDS is more necessary than ever now? Thank you very much.
I do not believe there's any evidence that the Israeli government is collapsing. I think a large amount remains to be seen. I don't know what the outcome of the current hostilities is going to be. And I think it's just very early to predict where things will stand at the end. What we can say with what we can say for certain is that probably somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of Gazans have been killed, and that Gaza is no more. Gaza is gone. There was an article yesterday in which the estimates were made that it would take 350 years to rebuild Gaza. So regardless of the outcome politically, what can be said with certainty right now is probably hundreds of thousands of people were killed in Gaza, have been killed in Gaza, and that Gaza is no more. As for the second question with BDS, I'm not one who finds slogans very useful. One has to analyze every situation carefully and then to decide what is the most effective tactic at any given point. BDS is not a political solution, it's a tactic. Boycotts, divestment, sanctions, those are tactics, and tactics have to be decided upon based on a concrete situation of what would be most effective at a particular moment.
If you have time, one quick question. Someone said that I have heard about criminal groups in Gaza, but have not found a lot of information about this. What is their role in the conflict? Do they have any power?
I couldn't get what's wrong.
I think it's something about the criminal groups in Gaza.
Groups, I can't hear you. What group?
Criminal groups in Gaza.
Look, Israel has systematically attacked Gaza's police force. It has made a point of attacking Gaza's police force so as to create chaos and anarchy in Gaza. So inevitably, if you target the civil police in Gaza, as Israel has done, amidst the chaos and anarchy, of course, criminal groups are going to emerge.
Okay, I think that's all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.